All right, here we're going to go through our lesson for section 7.3 and dealing with our special products of binomials. So our learning target, we always want to start there, is I can recognize and multiply special products. This recognizing is going to save you a bunch of time down the road, so it's really important to start recognizing those. This is the little piece of paper we're going to use today, and this is it, so there's not a huge section. So there's two special products that we're going to be looking at. We're going to be looking at a square of a binomial, and then the sum and difference pattern. And these are patterns that will save you time when we're both when we're multiplying and when we start factoring. Okay? So here we go. The square of a binomial. And I'm going to give you the algebra, and then we're going to work through an example. So what the algebra tells us is that if I have the square of a binomial, right? So a binomial squared, it is not the same thing as when I multiply that in, as when I distribute that exponent in. I can't do that, because what this really means is I have a plus b times a plus b. So if you want to write that out and then actually do your multiplying, you sure can. But there's a pattern for this one. So when I see I'm adding, I'm going to end up with a squared plus 2ab plus b squared, always. So I can take my first term and square it, multiply my two terms together and multiply it by 2, and then take my last term and square it. And that will always be that pattern. Well, what if I'm subtracting? What if I have a minus b squared? So again, if you don't recognize this pattern, you can always say, okay, I've got a minus b times a minus b, because this exponent tells us how many times we're multiplying by. So here I will end up with a squared minus 2ab, but then I have a positive b squared plus b squared. And the reason is because when I take this b and multiply it by itself, a negative times a negative gives me that positive. Okay, so here's our two different patterns. So let's walk through just a quick example. So if I have 3x plus 4 squared, I'm adding, so I know I'm going to follow this top one. So my pattern is going to end up being a squared. So when I square this term, I end up 3 times 3 is 9, and x times x is x squared. Plus 2 times, I multiply these together, 4 times 3x is 12x times 2 is 24x, and then I have my b squared, so plus 16. So following this pattern can be a lot simpler and faster than trying to write it out, because this is also the same thing as 3x plus 4 times 3x plus 4. So we can write it out like that, and then following what we learned in our last section, multiply those out, or we can just start to follow these patterns. Okay, so now let's look at our sum and difference pattern. That's the next pattern we're really going to be looking at. And when we start factoring, you'll learn this part of this pattern is the difference of two squares. So if I have a plus b and a minus b, okay, so the same thing is in our first part of our terms, and the same thing is in the second part, but there's one's a plus and one's a minus, one's a sum and one's a difference. That's where the name comes from. Then I know that I'm going to have a squared minus b squared. Okay, and remember that when I'm dealing with these equal signs, we can work backwards as well. They go both directions. Because what this is telling me, right, is when I multiply these out and I distribute this, or I do my box method, or I multiply it vertically, my middle terms will cancel out because one's a plus and one's a minus. So let's look at an example. Here I've got we're going to use x plus 5 and x minus 5. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and first multiply these out exactly what we did in our last lesson, so we can see how it works to this anyways. So I see that they're kind of the same, but one's a plus and one's a minus. So I'm going to multiply them out. So I've got x plus 5 and x minus 5, and I'm going to use the vertical method here. Negative 5 times negative 5 is negative 25. Negative 5 times x is negative 5x. X times 5 is 5x, and x times x is x squared. So when I add those together, I end up with x squared. Here I have a negative 5x and a positive 5x, so those cancel each other out, minus 25. Oh, that looks a lot like what this pattern So if I just follow my pattern, a squared would give me x squared minus b squared, so 5 times 5 is 25. I end up with the same thing. So that's how we get to this pattern that will work all the time. So now we can just look and follow our pattern without having to actually sit down and do all of the multiplication. Okay? Those are our two special patterns that we're learning about and that we're really going to look at. So now you have time to go through and use these patterns, keep them out with you while you're working on your homework so that you can refer back to them and know exactly what you're doing and where your numbers and values go. Okay? So now you're going to be spending some time working on that homework. And whenever you get stuck or want me to walk through some of these problems with you, go ahead and just give me a call or come in and find me.